welcome everybody, and thanks for taking some time out of your evening to participate in our public lecture series. We're really excited to have Sarah McGeown with us here today. I think she touches on a topic that so many of us talk about all the time and wonder about all the time, but really have no expertise in, which seems like the perfect sort of thing to have for a public lecture series. So Sarah McGeown she has a very long title, so I already asked her in advance if it was okay if I read it, because otherwise I'll get it wrong. But she's Deputy Director of Research, Knowledge Exchange and Impact in the School of Education and Sport at the University of Edinburgh, and she's also a Senior Lecturer in Developmental Psychology at that university. And as I alluded to, she's interested in participatory research approaches and collaborative research practices to understand and improve young people's reading experiences and outcomes, and maximising their motivation to become readers, which is something I think is many teachers and parents find is a huge roadblock in their children's journey in learning to read. So without any further ado, I'll pass over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. I will just share my screen now. Danielle, could you just tell me if you can see this?
It's working perfectly.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you. As I said, thank you very much for inviting me along today. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to speak with you all about a topic which is really important to me. And this is about understanding and supporting children and young people's motivation and engagement in reading. So just to give a summary of the topics that I plan to cover today, I'll speak briefly about what I mean by the terms reading motivation, reading engagement, and talk about what the research says in relation to motivation and engagement and a broad range of positive outcomes. I'll then talk about what motivates children and young people to read, so what the research evidence says to date, before moving on to talk about principles which can support motivation and engagement in primary school and secondary school contexts. And finally, I'll finish up today talking about collaborative research practices and different ways of working with children, young people, teachers, and other professionals in order to understand and develop research in this area, and before sharing some resources at the end. Okay, so first of all, as I said, I'll focus a little bit on what we mean by the terms reading motivation, engagement, and how these relate to a wide range of rich and diverse positive outcomes. So the study of reading motivation, I suppose the sort of scientific study of reading motivation, really suffers in a way from a sort of lack of conceptual clarity. And there's a really interesting conceptual review published almost a decade ago now, actually, which drew on a body of research over the previous decade and had looked at the different ways in which reading motivation had been defined and operationalized in terms of the research in that period. And the idea behind the conceptual review was to come to some sort of consensus about what we mean by the terms reading motivation so that we can continue to carry out research in this area. So I think there's a few distinctions and a few points that I want to make about this. The first is that there is a lot of research that looks at the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic reading motivation. So intrinsic reading motivation reflects this internal desire to want to read. So a child reads because they are interested in learning more about their interests, or they just want to relax, or they want to laugh, or they want to spend time with fictional friends, or they want to escape to another world. So these are sort of intrinsic or internal reasons as to why a child might want to read. Whereas extrinsic reading motivation reflects reading in order to obtain a separable outcome. So for example, reading because their teacher has told them to, or because they want to get praise from their parents. And what a lot of research has shown is that it's intrinsic reading motivation, which is more closely associated with reading engagement, time spent reading, but also positive reading outcomes as well. So as teachers, I'd really emphasize, and as parents as well, I'd really emphasize the importance of promoting these intrinsic aspects of reading. As a result of the conceptual review, reading motivation was defined as the drive to read resulting from a comprehensive set of an individual's beliefs about, attitudes towards, and goals for reading. So if I just break this down, when we talk about an individual's beliefs about reading, we mean their beliefs about themselves as readers, so their self-perceptions of themselves as readers and the extent to which they think that they're good at reading or not. But it also reflects their beliefs about reading and the extent to which they see reading as being an enjoyable, important and worthwhile activity. Attitudes towards reading reflects children's enjoyment of reading, so the extent to which they have positive attitudes towards reading or not. Whereas goals for reading reflects the different goals or reasons as to why a child might choose to read. So a child might choose to read because they are curious to learn more about something, or because they like that feeling of immersion within a book and the sort of absorption that comes with that as well. And the more goals you have and the kind of the deeper your goals, the more likely you are to choose to read. Okay, so this is the concept of reading motivation. Reading engagement is that sort of, if you have reading motivation, then you move to sort of reading engagement afterwards. And reading engagement is a multidimensional construct. And there's a really recent systematic review which looked at reading engagement research and looked at these different aspects of engagement. So behavioural engagement basically reflects children's reading behaviours. So how often they read, for how long, and what type of text they read as well. So is it books or other text types? If they read books, is it fiction or non-fiction, or what genres, for example? So this is behavioural engagement, the child's reading behaviours. Cognitive engagement reflects a child's level of cognitive effort while reading and the implementation of strategies to support their comprehension. So a child who's cognitively engaged when they're reading, if they come to a word that they don't know, they may be more likely to try and work out what that word is. Or if they come to a passage of text that doesn't make sense to them, they may be more likely to look back in order to resolve their understanding or to reread again. So children who are reading with a high level of cognitive engagement are really putting into place this cognitive effort and are putting into place strategies as well, which should support their comprehension. Affective engagement reflects the sort of emotions and feelings that are experienced while children read and the depth and quality of their emotional engagement with the text. So it reflects things such as exploring personally meaningful content when we read, using one's imagination, empathizing with characters, feeling connected to the characters that you read within books. And so it's these kind of emotional experiences that a child has as they read. And these first three aspects of engagement all reflect the child as a solitary reader, so the child in the book. Whereas social engagement is sort of broadening this up to thinking about the social interactions that children can have when they discuss books with others, whether this are peers, friends, teachers, or members of their family. So what I thought I'd do now is just sort of show what the research demonstrates in terms of this relationship from intrinsic reading motivation, so this desire to want to read, how this can have an impact on different types of reading engagement, and then how it can go on to influence, as I said, these sort of rich and diverse positive outcomes that can come from book reading. So we know that children who are more intrinsically motivated to read are more likely to spend time reading. They'll read longer, they'll read more frequently, they're more likely to read books as well. And again, there's been a considerable body of research that shows that time spent reading has a positive impact on these types of outcomes, but specifically reading and language skills. Intrinsic reading motivation also has an influence on children's cognitive engagement as well. As I said, this is the cognitive effort, the implementation of strategies to improve comprehension. And again, research has shown that these are linked to different outcomes. Again, most specifically, reading and language skills as well. So for example, recent research by Miyamoto and colleagues looked at the relationship between intrinsic reading motivation and reading outcomes and showed that it was mediated by behavioural and cognitive aspects of engagement. Intrinsic reading motivation also affects affective engagement as well. As I said, this is children's opportunity to just simply enjoy reading, relax while they read, explore personally meaningful content. And there's been quite a lot of research, albeit with adults, but some with children as well, and some qualitative research too, which has shown the relationship between this and some of the outcomes listed here, such as social skills, empathy, identity development, perspective taking, and well-being. And this is some of the work of Raymond Marr and colleagues, but also Vazali and colleagues too. And finally, as I said, this reflects the sort of solitary child reading, and this is the aspect of engagement, which is about the child discussing books with others. And again, there's been quite a lot of research which has shown how this is related to the types of positive outcomes here. And actually quite a lot of the research in this area has not necessarily come from psychologists, but has actually come from researchers who carry out research with a sort of more social cultural lens. Okay, so what motivates children and young people to read? Well, I think especially in the last few years, there's been quite a lot of research which has looked at reading skill and how reading skill is a strong predictor of children's reading motivation. So a recent meta-analysis by Jessica Tosti and colleagues showed that earlier reading skill was a stronger prediction of reading motivation than motivation was of skill, although there was this bidirectional relationship later on within primary school. Twin data by Alistair Van Bergen and colleagues again came to a similar conclusion, that it's children's reading skill that determines how much they choose to read rather than vice versa. And then longitudinal research published by Mina Torpa and colleagues recently again showed that it was children's reading skill that influenced their reading engagement, so their leisure time and reading activities. So quite a lot of research which shows that the importance, I suppose, of making sure that children get off to the best start in their reading skills very early on, because reading skill is important for reading motivation. In my own research, I've looked at other child characteristics in addition to skill. So for example, age. There's very consistent research that shows that children's motivation to read declines with age. You also see very consistent sex differences as well, where girls on average are more likely to say they're motivated to read than boys. Although in a couple of research studies that I carried out, I found that it was children's gender identity that was a stronger predictor of their motivation to read. So children who identify more with traditional or stereotypical feminine traits are more motivated to read than those who identify with more masculine traits. And actually gender identity is a stronger predictor of motivation than sex. And again, in another research study, I looked at children's personality characteristics and found that it wasn't those children who were conscientious who said they were motivated to read, but actually those children who are more open to experiences and more intellectually curious. And in this study, we found that actually children's personality characteristics were a stronger predictor of their motivation to read as their reading skill and competency beliefs combined. So all of this is very much focused on the child and their own characteristics, but we also know that context and environmental factors are important too. So again, a recent systematic review and meta-analysis looked at different types of motivational reading instruction practices and the implications of these for children's reading motivation. And all of the research that I'm citing here is also research which has been carried out by psychologists, but actually a lot of literacy researchers which come from sort of sociocultural tradition also have an awful lot to offer in terms of the importance of the messages that children get about reading, about the access that children and young people have to books as well, and how these different things can shape their motivation and engagement. And again, all of the research that I'm citing here is quantitative studies. So we have examples of systematic reviews, meta-analyses, twin data, longitudinal studies. But actually, sometimes it can be really helpful to just speak to children and young people themselves. And in the last few years, I've sort of shifted from doing quite a lot of quantitative research to also carrying out qualitative research as well, to hear from young people and from children about their experiences with reading and why they choose to read or not. So I'm going to share some of that now. So the project that I'm going to describe here is the Growing Up a Reader project, which was carried out, I think, back in 2018, 2019. And this was a project actually carried out in collaboration with children and young people. So we trained, you can see the children here, we trained 12 primary school children and 10 secondary school children in order to join our research team. They received research training before going on to interview their peers about what they thought a reader meant and what they do and don't read and why they do and don't read different text types. And I'll share some of the research papers from this at the end. But in terms of why children said they read books, they spoke about reading books just to be entertained, to relax, to experience escapism, to learn new things. They spoke about some books being exciting or thrilling, particularly adventure books or scary books. They spoke about familiarity as well. So the opportunity to read gives you time, it gives you an opportunity to spend time with fictional friends or having familiarity with certain book authors or series as well. They spoke about reading being a social thing, about it challenging them, giving them opportunities to develop their reading skills, and that it was also just a habit, so they just simply read out of habit. In terms of why young people said they read books, so these are members of our teenage research team, they spoke about reading books in order to learn, in order to relax, to experience escapism, for this feeling of absorption or immersion in the books. They spoke about reading as developing their empathy skills, about it being exciting, about the sort of social reasons for reading as well, and that reading provides a form of social capital. And these were, I suppose, some of the kind of more intrinsic motivators, but they also spoke about extrinsic motivators as well. So, for example, school, parents, and media all having an influence on their reading. And this was specifically in relation to films that they'd maybe seen that then prompted them to go on to want to read the book. In terms of why young people said they didn't read books, I thought I'd share this now because it's actually really helpful and really useful when we think about understanding the experiences of children and of teenagers as well, and understanding the barriers, I suppose, to book reading too. So one of the things that they said was simply that reading was just not encouraged, that when they were in primary school, they were encouraged to read for pleasure, but these teenagers were 15, 16 at the time and just said that now no one encouraged them to read anymore, and so they just didn't do it. Some said that they'd lost the habit and they didn't recognise at what time this has happened, but they realised that they did used to read and enjoy reading, but they just didn't do this anymore. Some said that it was not cool. They spoke about it being time consuming as well. There were comments made that books for teenagers are often just really big, thick books, and it's a really big commitment to read a book of that size, and they just didn't have the time to do that, which I think really speaks to what we should be thinking about within the publishing industry, about creating shorter books in order to get teens back into reading again. They spoke about book reading as being effortful, not just reading books, but also finding books as well, that process of maybe going to a library or a bookshop and finding books. Whereas on their phone, they said personalised content just pops up all the time and they can read that. It's much easier for them to access this, and it's always personalised to them. And they spoke about other activities just taking priority, that they found it difficult to find a book that they thought that they'd enjoy, that they'd got out of the habit of selecting books which would really interest them and reflect their skills. They spoke about environmental issues as well, so associated with paper books, that books were expensive, that they were just inconvenient to carry around as well, that they had no time. So as I said, these were 15, 16-year-olds who were undertaking exams at the time. And then some just said that they'd grown out of reading. So as I said, there was an awful lot that was said there that helped us to really understand what's going on in this period of life and the different reasons why teenagers may not read. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to talk about principles to support motivation and engagement in reading. And the principles that I'm going to be talking about are related to a project which we're running at the moment, which is called Love to Read. And this started in September last year, and it'll be finishing in February next year. But Love to Read is a programme which we are creating, a group of researchers in collaboration with teachers, but with children as well, to inspire and sustain a love of reading. And the project is aimed at children in the final 3 years of primary school, so around about the ages of 8 to 9 to 11 to 12. We are going through 3 phases, so 2 phases to develop the programme and 1 phase to evaluate the programme. And the first 2 phases involve drawing upon what the theory and research says in this area, in addition to children's insights, before working with a team of teachers in order to co-design the programme. And then we'll be evaluating it in autumn of this year. So as I said, Love to Read aims to draw upon theory, research, children's insights, in addition to teachers' professional and pedagogical knowledge, experience and expertise. And this project really reflects a sort of collaborative approach to research, which I'll be talking about at the end. So Love to Read is underpinned by 6 research-informed principles. I'll be going through each of them soon, but you can see them all reflected here. These illustrations have just been complete, so they were just completed last week. We've had a fantastic illustrator working with us on the project, And we've been working in collaboration with classes of children across the UK. So we've had 5 classes of children across the UK give input and feedback into the different iterations of these illustrations. And the idea is that these principles and these illustrations are ways for us to communicate the project with young people and with children, so they understand what the program's about, what we're trying to achieve, and they feel some ownership over the project as well. And if you're interested in learning more about the project, you can access the website. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just briefly go through each of these principles in turn. So the first principle is the principle of access. And this is just about making sure that children have regular and easy access to books at school, which align with their reading habits and interests. And again, there's been a considerable body of research which shows that children are more motivated to read when they have access to a wide range of reading materials, which reflect their personal experiences, their interests, and their abilities as well. And I think it's really important from a teacher's perspective to think about access from the different perspectives of children within your class. Because what may be good access for one child, so one child might have access to books in the school library or on bookshelves which reflect their personal experiences, their interests and their abilities. Another child may not necessarily have this. So it's important that we think about the provision within schools and within classes from the perspectives of all the children within their class as well, and that we involve children in decisions about what sorts of books they should have access to within school. The second principle is that of choice, and this is about making sure that children have choice over their independent reading activities, and that schools have a structure and children are taught the skills to ensure that they're able to make good reading choices. And by good reading choices, I mean choices which reflect their interests, but also their abilities as well. And again, this is embedded in quite a lot of research which has shown the importance of giving children choice and how this is central to supporting motivation to read. But we know that children may vary in their ability to make good reading choices. So more experienced readers have accrued a lot more experience in this process of selecting books and choosing books which reflect their interests, whereas children who maybe don't read as often just haven't had that same level of experience. So within the Love to Read programme, we're going to be looking at how we can develop all children's skills in selecting books which reflect their interests and abilities, either through explicit instruction or teacher modelling as well. But in addition to teaching children these skills to make good reading choices, we also need to make sure that schools have the structure to support choice. And this is about how schools display books, how they categorise books as well within their library or classrooms to make sure that choice is as easy for pupils as it possibly can be. Time is about making sure that children have regular quality time to read books they engage with in school and at home. And there's been a lot of research which shows the importance of this behavioural engagement, so time spent reading, and how this is really important for children's reading outcomes. But in particular, research has shown that time spent reading books as opposed to any other text types is important, and actually fiction books as opposed to non-fiction seems to be important in terms of children's reading comprehension skills. In addition, a lot of research points to the importance of leisure time reading activities. So while with Love to Read, we will be encouraging time to read for pleasure in class, it's really important that this is a sort of starting point and that we're also encouraging out of class reading activity. Now, reading time can take different forms. It can be simply a child reading a book, but it can also be discussions with others about books that they've read too. But what's most important is that it's on task, that children are deeply engaged in the reading activities that they're involved in. Connection is about making sure that children can access and choose books and book reading activities which feel personally relevant and relevant to their reading goals as well. So this idea of personal connection is about children having access to books which reflect them, their own experiences, their culture, their ethnicity, their interests as well. And so that when children read a book, that they feel this sort of connection with the characters or the stories that they're reading about. And this gives them opportunities, as I've said before, to explore personally meaningful content. And there's been quite a lot of research that shows that reducing the sort of psychological distance between the character and the reader actually leads to enhanced absorption or immersion within a book. And then, so this is one aspect of connection, which is about this sort of personal connection. But another aspect of connection is about connecting the book that a child reads with their reading goals. So we know that children are more engaged when reading if the books that they read and also the reading activities that they engage in are aligned with their reading goals. So after carrying out the Growing Up a Reader project that I spoke about earlier, where we trained the children and young people to interview their peers, and reading what children said when they spoke about reading, I began to think about reading books as offering different types of experiences. So reading offers children opportunities to laugh, to escape to different worlds, to pursue their interests. And so this idea of connecting to reading goals is about making sure that the book that the child chooses reflects the type of experience that they're seeking. And as adult readers, we do this ourselves. If we're in the mood for a book which just is an easy read, then we'll select one type of book. If we're in the mood for a book to learn something new, then we'll select that book. And so our reading goals, the connection between our reading goals and the book that we've selected is really important as well. So in Love to Read, we'll be asking children to reflect on what type of experience they're looking for within a book so they can make this connection. Social is about making sure that children have the time, the opportunities and the skills to share and discuss books with others. And as I said, there's been a lot of research from psychologists, but also those sociocultural researchers who look at the importance of kind of social reading environments and the importance of developing reading communities and reading cultures within schools as well. Social interactions can take different forms. It can include talking about books with others, friends, peers, teachers, family, sharing books with others, writing about books with others as well. So there's lots of different ways to sort of develop these social interactions. However, I think it's important to recognise that not all children necessarily like talking about books with others. Some children might prefer to write book reviews and to share their thoughts or communicate their thoughts in different ways. As part of the Love to Read programme, as we've been developing it, in phase 1, we actually interviewed children, a group of about 60 children, to hear what they thought about all of these different principles. And actually one child said that they hate talking about books with other people because they're always worried that they're going to spoil it for them as well. And I think that this is a really important point, and this is why it's so important to speak to children as well and to find out their perceptions on the types of programme that we're developing. And finally, success is about making sure that children have a broad range of positive and successful reading goals, reading experiences, that they can set meaningful reading goals, and that they recognise their growing success as readers as well. And theories of reading motivation, so for example, expectancy value theory and self-determination theory, really centralise the importance of success within it. We also know, and I've shared some of this research already, that reading skill is important for reading motivation and engagement as well. But within Love to Read, we recognise and we stress the importance of a kind of broader conceptualisation of success. So success is not just about being able to read well. Success is also feeling more confident in choosing books which reflect your interests. It can be about choosing to read at home when you didn't previously, discovering a new author or a new genre that you really enjoy, feeling more confident talking about books with other people as well. So it's really important that children start to develop a broader understanding of what it means to be a reader and to be a successful reader as well, so that they can see how they're developing as readers, but that they can also set goals that they want to achieve too. Okay. So now I'm going to move on to talking about collaborative research practices, because I think that this is a really useful way for us to study motivation and engagement in reading, but actually just study different aspects of language and literacy more generally. So for the last 5 years or so, I would say that all of the research that I've been carrying out has either been participatory or collaborative in nature. One of the reasons for this is because I recognise that there's a real disconnect between what goes on in universities, the type of research that goes on there, and what's happening within educational practice. Whereas if we work in partnership or in collaboration with others, so for example with children, young people, teachers, speech and language therapists, and other stakeholders, then we are in an opportunity to really work with people who have a very sort of shared or similar interests to ourselves, that is supporting children's language and literacy skills, but who have different areas of knowledge, expertise and influence as well. So it's a really powerful combination, I think, working with people who have these different insights to those that researchers have. And so participatory research is a sort of form of collaborative research practice, which offers a sort of inclusive context for individuals to get more involved in research and to learn about and contribute towards the research, which is ultimately going to affect them. And in the last few years, as I said, we've been carrying out research in this area, but we're also starting to evaluate some of the methods that we can use as well, so that we can contribute towards understanding of how to carry out good participatory or collaborative research. So one paper which was published last year is actually based on the Growing Up a Reader project. So this is looking at what happens when children interview their peers as opposed to adult-led interviews, and the similarities and differences that you might expect when interviews are led by children versus led by adults, and the types of ethical considerations that need to be made too. And then this other one is looking at working in collaboration with teachers in order to co-design educational interventions. And it outlines a framework in order to do this and an evaluation of this framework too, and also stresses the value of working in this collaborative way with teachers when designing educational interventions or programs. Before I move on to talk about specific projects, I thought it might be useful just to highlight this special issue that we have coming out. In fact, some of the papers are even coming out now. The special issue is in the Journal of Research and Reading. It's called Language and Literacy, Connecting Research and Practice. And it's been edited by Jessie Ricketts, myself, and Megan Dixon. If you want to access any of these papers, then they're out now. I think there's only 2 or 3 papers still to come out. And they cover a diverse range of topics, different methodological approaches, and different ways of collaborating with other stakeholders in order to conduct research. I think within the special issue, there's lots of good examples of how we can work in partnership with others, but I hope it will also be seen as a sort of call for us to do this type of research more and to do this research better as well. But certainly within the special issue, I feel like there's a lot of really great examples of different types of partnerships happening and the benefits that you can see from these partnerships. So earlier I've been speaking about motivation and engagement. What I thought it might be useful to do now is just to talk about some of the different projects that we have running at the moment and the different ways in which we're collaborating with others in order to conduct this research. So this is just a link to the website where we share all of our research projects. And this is just a list of some of the current projects that we have running and previous projects as well. And I thought it might be useful, first of all, to talk briefly about the Love to Read project and the model of collaboration that we have going on there. So the Love to Read project is about developing a programme to inspire and sustain a love of book reading among children aged 8 to 12. There are 3 phases to the project. So the first phase was this literature review in order to identify the 6 research-informed principles which would underpin the programme. We then interviewed Emily Oxley, who's a postdoctoral researcher on this project. She interviewed about 60 children in 4 UK schools to find out what they thought about these different principles and their ideas of practices to support their motivation and engagement in reading. And then we synthesized all of this into quite a lengthy document, which we shared with teachers in order to co-design the programme in phase 2. I should say all of the projects that we're running at the moment align with open science practices, so we pre-register all of our studies and also make all of the materials that we use available too. So we're currently in phase 2 of the Love to Read programme. We've had 4 meetings with our teachers so far, and we've still got 2 meetings to go. These 6 teachers have been selected to reflect teachers who have an interest and passions for supporting reading for pleasure, who have experience in doing so, but who work in very different school and classroom contexts and have different levels of teaching experience as well. And so Emily and I are currently going through a process of co-designing the Love to Read programme with these 6 teachers. And then we also have the input from our research co-investigators, so Jessie Ricketts and Laura Shapiro, and our 5 project partners too. So this project's been carried out in collaboration with Scottish Book Trust, National Literacy Trust, Education Scotland, and Megan Dixon, who's also teachers involved, and Katrina Lucas, another teacher as well. And then after we've designed the programme, we are going to be evaluating the programme in a mixed method study in autumn. And as part of this evaluation, we're not just looking at the effectiveness of Love to Read, but we're also looking at how we can improve it based on what we learn from the implementation of this programme in actual real classroom contexts. and then we'll make revisions to the programme before it's freely available to all in February or March of next year. Okay, so that was the Love to Read project. Another project that I really briefly like to talk about today is the Reading and Narrative Fiction project, because this reflects an aspect of engagement, but specifically effective engagement. So we know that fiction books often reflect the social world that we live in. So they provide us with opportunities to think, to explore personally meaningful content and to understand ourselves, but also other people better too. So through fiction, we can, as I've said here, we can learn more about ourselves and others, but they can also be really useful for supporting young people's identity development, empathy, and perspective taking. So this project aims to understand young people's experiences with reading fiction and looking at the extent to which reading provides a mirror and a window, and also this concept of a sliding glass door as well. So the idea of a mirror is the idea that when we read books, often we can see ourselves reflected in what we read, and through this can understand ourselves better. A window is this idea that we can see into the worlds of other people as well, and learn to understand them better. And then the idea of a sliding glass door is that we can actually go through this window in order to empathise and to see things from other people's perspectives. Elena's leading this project, and she's recently carried out these interviews with young people, and the next stage is to develop a reflective literacy practices guide in partnership with young people and secondary school librarians to sort of promote the sort of deep engagement that we hope that children and young people are able to get from reading books. And you can access more information about this on the webpage. And as I said, this one's also pre-registered, so you can access the interview schedule that we've used too. Moving on now to talking about another project, but this is the previous project, the Growing Up a Reader one. And as I said, the Growing Up a Reader project aimed to look at how children and young people perceive a reader, so what it means to be a reader in the 21st century, but also looking at the reasons for reading different text types. It was a project in collaboration with the Scottish Book Trust and Edinburgh's Museum of Childhood. And as I said before, we trained children and young people to join our research team, and they received research training at the University of Edinburgh, looking at the processes of carrying out interviews, ethical considerations as well, and they had lots of practice to interview their peers before carrying out interviews themselves under the supervision of an adult researcher. So if you're interested in learning more about this project, we have 4 papers which came out of it, all qualitative research papers, and one looking at sort of methodological considerations associated with it. And then the final project that I'm going to speak briefly about is the Improving Children's Reading project. So this was actually my first project, I suppose, which was, we could call to some extent collaborative in nature, but really it was a translational project. It was about translating research which I had already carried out independently as a researcher and looking at how this could be translated into practical insights for teachers. Prior to carrying out research into reading motivation and engagement, I actually was very interested in and did my PhD and subsequent research looking at the effectiveness of different types of initial reading instruction and looking at the impact of different types of reading instruction on children's reading strategies and the consequences for the skills which predicted reading success. So some of the research looked at this, some looked at the differences between reading and spelling and the effectiveness of different strategies for children's reading and spelling skills. Other research had looked at reading comprehension with different text types, and finally some work that I'd done on reading for pleasure. And I provided 4 workshops for teachers to come along to where they learned about the research, and then it was their responsibility to see how they could translate this into ideas for classroom practice. In total, I was working with 6 local authorities in Scotland, so I had 3 or 4 schools in each local authority with about 70 teachers involved in total. And we've developed a whole range of resources, for example, short videos and posters as well, which is about translating the research which I independently as a researcher had conducted, but translating that into accessible resources for teachers, which hopefully they see to be sort of educationally relevant or meaningful for them as well. So the full name of the project was Improving Children's Reading Research Informing Practice. And I think sort of a year or so after I'd carried it out, I really reflected on this final part about research informing practice, because it suggests this really sort of one directional way where the researcher conducts the research and then they just share that with the teachers. whereas a lot of the work that I do now is far more collaborative in nature, and I talk a lot more about connecting research and practice, so working in partnership together from the beginning to make sure that the research that you're carrying out is educationally relevant and meaningful for teachers as well, and that they have input into that research too. And I think this is really reflected within the LOCO network, which I co-founded with Lynn Duncan at the University of Dundee in 2019. So LOCO stands for Language and Literacy, Communication, Collaboration, Co-production. And we're a multidisciplinary network of individuals who have a shared interest in supporting children and young people's language and literacy skills, but have different areas of knowledge, expertise, and influence. And if you're interested in learning anything more about LOCO or looking at some of the resources that we have, then you can visit our website here. We had a specific workshop on motivating reading for pleasure, so you might find some of the talks from that workshop relevant now. Okay, just some final resources before I finish. So the first is a mini book which was written specifically for teachers. It was published last year. This was written with Catherine Wilkinson, who's Head of Research and Evaluation at the Scottish Book Trust. Her and I work really closely together, and we wanted to write just a really short book for teachers, which would draw upon sort of a large body of theory and research, but also looked at how we could make this relevant and meaningful for teachers. For children, there's actually an article that we have out earlier this year. This has been led by PhD researcher Charlotte Webber. It's an article for children. If you're not familiar with Frontiers for Young Minds, these are research articles which are written specifically for children and also reviewed by children too. So if you're interested in how books can help children to make meaningful connections with fictional characters, then there's this book here. And I was also told, I think, that maybe some parents would be along at this session as well. And I think particularly for parents who have children who have difficulties with reading, it can be really difficult finding books which really reflect their interests, but at the right reading level. So I know of, for example, a UK publisher called Barrington Stoke, and as a publisher, they're committed to publishing only books which are really engaging and really interesting, which are maybe written with slightly easier vocabulary and words, so that they're more accessible for children with reading difficulties. And I should say as well, I forgot to say this with the Love to Read programme, one of the things that I'm really aware of is that we are creating a whole class programme, but what we don't want to do is for it to in any way sort of amplify the inequalities that might exist in children's reading for pleasure already. So it's really important within it that we are thinking about the needs of children with reading difficulties. One of our teachers on the co-design team is dyslexic. Within our expert advisory group, we also have someone who's got a key interest in supporting children with reading difficulties too. And we will be thinking about sort of targeted support for children who don't read for pleasure, maybe just because they've had really negative experiences with reading or have struggled as readers. So that's me finished now. Thank you for listening. And I hope that there's an opportunity for me to answer any questions that you might have.